Section 18 of Confessions, volumes 5 and 6. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Confessions, volumes 5 and 6, by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, anonymously translated. Section 18. I was so much better, and had gained such an appetite by exercise, that I stopped a whole day at the Pont de Lunel, for the sake of good entertainment and company, this being deservedly esteemed at that time the best inn in Europe. For those who kept it, knowing how to make its fortunate situation turn to advantage, took care to provide both abundance and variety. It was really curious to find in a lonely country house a table every day furnished with sea and freshwater fish, excellent game, and choice wines, served up with all the attention and care which are only to be expected among the great or opulent, and all this for 35 sous each person. But the Pont de Lunel did not long remain on this footing, for the proprietor, presuming too much on its reputation, at length lost it entirely. During this journey I really forgot my complaints, but recollected them again on my arrival at Montpellier. My vapors were absolutely gone, but every other complaint remained, and though custom had rendered them less troublesome, they were still sufficient to make any one who had been suddenly seized with them suppose himself attacked by some mortal disease. In effect, they were rather alarming than painful, and made the mind suffer more than the body, though it apparently threatened the latter with destruction. While my attention was called off by the vivacity of my passions, I paid no attention to my health. But as my complaints were not altogether imaginary, I thought of them seriously when the tumult had subsided. Recollecting the salutary advice of Madame de Larnage, and the cause of my journey, I consulted the most famous practitioners, particularly Monsieur Fils, and through superabundance of precaution boarded at a doctor's, who was an Irishman and named Fitzmaurice. This person boarded a number of young gentlemen who were studying physic, and what rendered his house very commodious for an invalid, he contented himself with a moderate pension for provisions, lodging, etc., and took nothing of his boarders for attendance as a physician. He even undertook to execute the orders of Monsieur Fils, and endeavored to re-establish my health. He certainly acquitted himself very well in this employment. As to regimen, indigestions were not to be gained at his table, and though I am not much hurt at privations of that kind, the objects of comparison were so near, that I could not help thinking with myself sometimes that Monsieur le Marquis de Torignan was a much better provider than Monsieur Fitzmaurice. Notwithstanding, as there was no danger of dying with hunger, and all the youths were gay and good humored, I believe this manner of living was really serviceable, and prevented my falling into those languors I had latterly been so subject to. I passed the morning in taking medicines, particularly I know not what kind of waters, but believe they were those of Valls, and in writing to Madame de Larnage; for the correspondence was regularly kept up, and Rousseau kindly undertook to receive these letters for his good friend Dudding. At noon I took a walk to the Canourg with some of our young boarders, who were all very good lads. After this we assembled for dinner. When this was over, an affair of importance employed the greater part of us till night. This was going a little way out of town to take our afternoon's collation, and make up 2 or 3 parties at Mal or Mallet. As I had neither strength nor skill, I did not play myself, but I betted on the game, and interested for the success of my wager, followed the players and their balls over rough and stony roads, procuring by this means both an agreeable and salutary exercise. We took our afternoon's refreshment at an inn out of the city. I need not observe that these meetings were extremely merry, but should not omit that they were equally innocent, though the girls of the house were very pretty. Monsieur Fitzmaurice, who was a great mall player himself, was our president; and I must observe, notwithstanding the imputation of wildness that is generally bestowed on students, that I found more virtuous dispositions among these youths than could easily be found among an equal number of men. They were rather noisy than fond of wine, and more merry than libertine. I accustomed myself so much to this mode of life, and it accorded so entirely with my humor, that I should have been very well content with a continuance of it. Several of my fellow boarders were Irish, from whom I endeavored to learn some English words, as a precaution for Saint Andiol. The time now drew near for my departure. Every letter Madame de Larnage wrote, she entreated me not to delay it, and at length I prepared to obey her. I was convinced that the physicians, who understood nothing of my disorder, looked on my complaint as imaginary, and treated me accordingly with their waters and whey. In this respect, physicians and philosophers differ widely from theologians, admitting the truth only of what they can explain, and making their knowledge the measure of possibilities. These gentlemen understood nothing of my illness, therefore concluded I could not be ill. And who would presume to doubt the profound skill of a physician? I plainly saw they only meant to amuse, and make me swallow my money, and judging their substitute at Saint Andiol would do me quite as much service, and be infinitely more agreeable, I resolved to give her the preference. Full, therefore, of this wise resolution, I quitted Montpellier. I set off towards the end of November, after a stay of 6 weeks or 2 months in that city, where I left a dozen louis, without either my health or understanding being the better for it, except from a short course of anatomy begun under Monsieur Fitzmaurice, which I was soon obliged to abandon from the horrid stench of the bodies he dissected, which I found impossible to endure. Not thoroughly satisfied in my own mind on the rectitude of this expedition, As I advanced towards the Pont du Saint Esprit, which was equally the road to Saint Andiol and to Chambéry, I began to reflect on Madame de Warrens, the remembrance of whose letters, though less frequent than those from Madame de Larnage, awakened in my heart a remorse that passion had stifled in the first part of my journey, but which became so lively on my return, that, setting just estimate on the love of pleasure, I found myself in such a situation of mind that I could listen wholly to the voice of reason. Besides, in continuing to act the part of an adventurer, I might be less fortunate than I had been in the beginning; for it was only necessary that in all Saint Andiol there should be one person who had been in England, or who knew the English or anything of their language, to prove me an impostor. The family of Madame de Larnage might not be pleased with me, and would perhaps treat me unpolitely. Her daughter too made me uneasy, for in spite of myself I thought more of her than was necessary. I trembled lest I should fall in love with this girl, and that very fear had already half done the business. Was I going in return for the mother's kindness to seek the ruin of the daughter? To sow dissension, dishonor, scandal, and hell itself in her family? The very idea struck me with horror, and I took the firmest resolution to combat and vanquish this unhappy attachment, should I be so unfortunate as to experience it. But why expose myself to this danger? How miserable must the situation be to live with the mother, whom I should be weary of, and sigh for the daughter, without daring to make known my affection. What necessity was there to seek this situation, and expose myself to misfortunes, affronts, and remorse, for the sake of pleasures whose greatest charm was already exhausted? For I was sensible this attachment had lost its first vivacity. With these thoughts were mingled reflections relative to my situation, and duty to that good and generous friend, who, already loaded with debts, would become more so from the foolish expenses I was running into, and whom I was deceiving so unworthily. This reproach at length became so keen that it triumphed over every temptation, and on approaching the Pont du Saint Esprit, I formed the resolution to burn my whole magazine of letters from Saint Andiol, and continue my journey right forward to Chambéry. I executed this resolution courageously, with some sighs, I confess, but with the heartfelt satisfaction, which I enjoyed for the first time in my life, of saying, I merit my own esteem, and know how to prefer duty to pleasure. This was the first real obligation I owed my books, since these had taught me to reflect and compare. After the virtuous principles I had so lately adopted, after all the rules of wisdom and honor I had proposed to myself, and felt so proud to follow, the shame of possessing so little stability, and contradicting so egregiously my own maxims, triumphed over the allurements of pleasure. Perhaps, after all, pride had as much share in my resolution as virtue. But if this pride is not virtue itself, its effects are so similar that we are pardonable in deceiving ourselves. One advantage resulting from good actions is that they elevate the soul to a disposition of attempting still better. For such is human weakness, that we must place among our good deeds an abstinence from those crimes we are tempted to commit. No sooner was my resolution confirmed than I became another man, or rather, I became what I was before I had erred, and saw in its true colors what the intoxication of the moment had either concealed or disguised. Full of worthy sentiments and wise resolutions, I continued my journey, intending to regulate my future conduct by the laws of virtue, and dedicate myself without reserve to that best of friends, to whom I vowed as much fidelity in future as I felt real attachment. The sincerity of this return to virtue appeared to promise a better destiny. But mine, alas, was fixed and already begun, even at the very moment when my heart, full of good and virtuous sentiments, was contemplating only innocence and happiness through life. I touched on the fatal period that was to draw after it the long chain of my misfortunes. End of section 18. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey.